Hi there. Your new module 7 is very much a deep dive into architecture. All about architecture and some of the most extraordinary architecture of Western art history. But it very much builds on what you just did in module 6 when you looked at the Romanesque and you saw that developing with the pilgrimage church. So I want to make sure you understand that thoroughly because you're going to be lost with the next segment if you don't feel like you've grasped the essentials of what you were reading and watching and talking about in Romanesque. So I particularly wanted to go to this extra credit discussion, which is so helpful. It's set up as a way for you to confront the fact that yes, architecture is really exciting, but it's difficult, especially the terminology. And the postings here are wonderful. So for Sierra, for instance, was really thinking carefully about how these pilgrimage churches are essentially massive stone sacred containers for bodies and body parts, for relics and reliquary, and asking a little bit about the details of the experience, the social experience of visiting that body. So I have a little response there for that. And Cole asked some really wonderful questions about getting clear and precise on terminology. And I want to highlight that because he did everyone a service. I want to make sure that his points are shared with everyone. So I'm going to go over them a little bit. And he shouldn't have apologized in advance. No, because what he's doing is he's helping everyone by getting very precise about what exactly is the difference between a column and a pier. When you read the textbook, they just race through with their descriptions and they say, oh, and there's the column and the pier and the pilaster and the engaged column, and your head is spinning and you have to stop and actually know the difference. So Cole got a very helpful response from Anam, who said, from what I can gather, a column is cylindrical, yes, and partially decorative, potentially, right? So, columns are often used to be sort of pretty in their rhythmic repetition. A pier's main purpose is structure, and as such is significantly more sturdy, yes. A pier is very much a hefty block that is a support. So a pier usually implies the massive major support, the hefty structure that does the big job of carrying the weight of what's above it. So this is the Arc de Triomphe in France. These are rectangular piers. Not all piers are rectangular, many are. But you can see the blocky sturdiness that Anam was talking about. You can feel how they are actually doing the work of the major work of support, and that's why they're so massive. If we go back to your old friend Hagia Sophia, it's very hard to see because this photograph shows the complex totality of the building. But if you look really zooming in, if you look very carefully right here, you see the rectangular, hefty, very solid, massive pier. And you can see how that contrasts with the columns, partly because the columns are round and the pier is rectangular. But more than that, the columns are relatively slender. They are weight-bearing with the arch of the arcade, but they cannot bear the kind of weight that the massive bulk of the piers can. And that's why, if you remember with Hagia Sophia, the pendentives here were such an innovation because they pour the weight directly into the piers so that the walls can be opened up with the arches and the columns, creating this openness, while the support of the dome is channeled directly into the piers. So a pier is based on the idea that a more massive solid is stronger in supporting weight than a narrower solid could be. This concept is going to be very important as we move into royal style cathedrals, which are also called Gothic cathedrals, where the buildings are going to aim to be incredibly tall and to seem ethereal, so that the stone that creates the building seems to dissolve into delicate patterns. And the architects will have to think about how to support very tall buildings. So this diagram right here is showing you in the red that these are piers. Notice that they are not now rectangular, because they are what are called compound piers, which means there's a rectangular, massive stone vertical that's been supplemented with what are called engaged columns. You'll learn about these little round, like columns that have been submerged into the pier, which is a way of making the pier prettier. But you can tell it's still a pier because even with those engaged columns, we're dealing with massive weight, massive proportions, as opposed to where we have a row of columns supporting an arch. Okay, and when we have that, we refer to it as an arcade because it's a kind of a continuous flowing structure of vertical and arch that leads all the way down the longitudinal space of the building, the way a wall would. But of course, what's important is that it's not a wall, it's not solid, it's open. So it indicates a kind of spatial divide, but it does so with the relatively delicate and pretty elements of a cylindrical column, which has a ornamental capital, and then that supports the curving arch. So Cole goes on to talk about the elevation of the building in terms of how we're going to look at arcade, gallery, clerestory. This is incredibly important going forward as well. Let me show you. So as Module 7 invites you to look at what happens to cathedral building in France as it becomes the French style, you will look at this very important cathedral, Chartres Cathedral. Chartres is the place name. And there are so many wonderful things and complex things to watch about these buildings, which are taking forever to load. But one of them certainly will be the elevation of the building and what is possible because of this three-part elevation, where you have an arcade, where you have a system of arches supported by here. These are piers with engaged columns supporting the rows of arches. So the arcade simply means this kind of flowing, longitudinal, continuous structure that moves along the building and defines the horizontal thrust of the building. But then vertically, above that, you have this smaller gallery space, and above that, this clerestory space where the light is pouring in. So this three-part structure has a kind of rhythm of tall, short, tall, but it also has a rhythm of the amount of light, the shadow, the light. And you will read more about that and see how that's connected to the idea of the Holy Trinity and the sacred elements brought into the cathedral. And Cole's last helpful question is about what's a buttress. And he very reasonably wonders, do we know the buttress by the shape? Because so many of these other architectural parts we know by the shape, like an arcade. But buttress is just a general term for any kind of a support. And it doesn't have to have a particular shape. When it does, it often will have a special name, such as a strip buttress, which is just an extra strip. And you saw that at the Church of Saint Vincent, where you have just this extra layer of stone is enough to be a buttress because it's just thickening the wall and therefore supporting. Or if you think back to Hagia Sophia, here we have these massive external piers that are just a buttress also, in that they are providing their thick, hefty support to push against the building so that if the building starts to collapse outward, it's balancing it. So one thing you'll find in the Gothic are external buttresses that combine the support of the arch with the idea of the buttress to create a flying buttress, where there's a curving arch and then there's a support system pushing against the building, which also has a strip buttress here, to make sure that that wall doesn't buckle and collapse this way, because this is strongly pushing back that way. So that you have oppositional force, right? The weight of the stone interior vaulting, the roof, could collapse out, but this buttress system is pushing back. And the shapes of these buttresses can be very different. This is a flying buttress. We can see these are often called quadrant buttresses when they are 1/4 of a circle. And they will be designed in various different ways. There's a quadrant arch right there at Durham Cathedral, because if you completed, that would be half, and then the rest of a circle. And so you see how this is kind of on the outside, supporting against the arch that's on the interior. So hopefully this will become clearer and clearer as we move forward into your next module.